let's get started. So welcome to Bible and Culture 101. So in this class, we're going to go through the historical context of the entire Bible very quickly. That's the first half. The second half will be an introduction to worldviews, a deeper dive into Christian worldview, what postmodernism is, what critical theory is, and kind of the few of the lies that are going around right now in culture. So with that, let's get started. The overall arching historical context of everything are these 4 chapters right here. We always start with creation. God created everything. All sovereign, all powerful, all loving. You know the characteristics of our Lord. Creation started human history. Then we move into chapter 2, which is the fall, which sin brought us death. We are now born spiritually dead, as you guys know, because of Adam and Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden. Then we move on to redemption. So once we were spiritually dead, there was no reconciliation with the Lord. So redemption brings us back into that relationship with the Lord, which is what He intended when He first created us. Restoration. This is when God is going to restore all things. And it culminates in the new heaven and the new earth. We are between redemption and restoration because as we are redeemed, He starts that restoration process in us. We are sanctified. We are slowly moving to be more like Christ. The thing about American Christianity is we tend to have a focus on just fall and redemption. But I want to bring all 4 chapters back to you because the entire story is very important. You wouldn't pick up a novel and read the middle 2 chapters and the last chapter because you wouldn't get the whole story. So I want you guys to keep these 4 chapters in mind because it encompasses all of our history as the way God intended. So how is the Bible organized? So the books of the Bible, as most of you guys know, are organized into 2 main sections. The Old Testament and the New Testament. Testament is another word for covenant. So the Old Testament covers the Old Covenant, and we'll briefly touch on that. And the New Testament covers the New Covenant, which is brought on by Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection to redeem humanity. In the Old Testament, it's divided up into books of the law, books of history, the wisdom books, the major prophets, and the minor prophets. Now, minor doesn't mean less important than major. Minor just means there's less pages. So really, that's the only distinction. It's just an easy way for us to remember and to divide up the Bible. Now, as most of you know, the books are not chronological. As we start going through this, and I put it in a historical context for you, I am going to go through them chronologically. The New Testament, the Gospels, historical books, the Pauline epistles, which are those epistles that we know the Apostle Paul wrote, the general epistles, and I will say this, some people believe Hebrews was written by the Apostle Paul, and some don't. So I'm just going to keep them in the general epistles, and then we close with the prophetic book of Revelation. All right, let's get started. You all ready? All right, Genesis 1 through 11. This encompasses the history of humanity, all of it, how we got started. So, God created the world in 6 days. He rested on the 7th day. Of course, that's where we get our week from, 7 days a week. Sunday is our day of rest. Adam and Eve sinned, as we just talked about, moving us into the fall, which is that 2nd chapter. So we are all born spiritually dead. Then the Lord said the wickedness of man was great. At this time, which is a little bit after 4000 BC, resulting in God's judgment on the entire earth with a flood. Of course, that's Noah's flood, which probably happened somewhere between 3000 BC and 2300 BC. Once repopulation of the earth started, then man started building a tower. There was pride in their heart, and the incident of the Tower of Babel comes into place. And this is where God spread everybody out, and confuse the languages. So people would start populating the earth. This is what the settlements began looking like after the Tower of Babel. So colors aren't important. I needed to find a map that just showed you guys that people were scattered. And they did start settlements all across the earth. And these are just the different people groups and this is how the secular history has classified them. So again, I'm just showing you that people did spread out. God's creation mandate was be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. Before the Tower of Babel, no one was filling the earth. They were all with a common language. They were all building their stairway to heaven. And they were not following God's creation mandate to fill the earth. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to zero in. So that was Genesis 1 through 11. How did it all start? How did everybody get spread out? Where did all these people groups come from? Now, the rest of the Old Testament focuses on what we call the Fertile Crescent. And so we're going to zero in on this. Of course, this is the ancient Near East. During Abraham's life, which we're going to talk about, he was the first patriarch that God called to start establishing the nation of Israel. Abraham is from the city of Ur. And in his travels, which you will read about in Genesis, or you have read about, he will follow the Euphrates and Tigris area up, and he comes back down through the land of Canaan. He spends some time in Egypt and back up through Canaan. So we'll go through that in just a minute. About the same time that we are talking about the history of the patriarchs of Israel, we meet Job. Job is probably the earliest written book of the Bible per many, many scholars, and so that's why he's up here next. So Job really deals with why do bad things happen to good people. When you read the book, you will have an insight into the spiritual realm, which is actually pretty interesting. Of course, you also have an insight to the Lord and what he ordains, and Satan and what he is capable of. So suffice it to say that when you read this book, you realize we don't know exactly why specific suffering happens, but that it doesn't happen unless the Lord ordains it. And I will say this, as you finish Job, you've realized that God brought him through his sufferings and taught him an awful lot. Also, when you read through the book of Job, his friends give him some questionable advice. Some of it's good, some of it is not so good. So just keep that in mind. All right, let's jump back into this patriarchal area. Genesis 15 through 20, the birth of the nation of Israel. So Abram is called from Ur to become the father of Israel. Abraham begets Isaac. Isaac begets Jacob. And there we have the three patriarchs of Israel. Jacob fathers 12 sons, who then go on to establish the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob's second to youngest son, Joseph, is the topic of the remainder portion of Genesis. Joseph ultimately settles in Egypt. And of course, as most of you guys know, God used Joseph to save his family who come down from Canaan because there is a worldwide famine at that time. So let's take a look at the map and what's going on. So the Egyptian Empire covers this yellow portion, and of course yours are in black and white, but color copies are expensive. So just know that Canaan was a vassal land of the Egyptian Empire at this time. Then we shift into the next four books, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So once the 12 tribes had moved down to Egypt, they start to grow. And they threaten the Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, because Joseph rose to prominence to be second in command. But then that Pharaoh died, and a later Pharaoh does not know who these Israelites, who these Hebrews are. That's really what they are referred to. God rescues them, uses Moses to rescue them, takes them out of Egypt, out of oppression, out of slavery, and into the promised land through the covenant that he made with Abraham. He promises them that they will inhabit this land and that they will become a great nation and that they will bless the world if they obey. This is a conditional covenant. The Exodus takes place about 1440 BC, so we're cruising through history right about now. Once they finish wandering in the land as God is preparing their hearts and minds and getting a new generation ready, Joshua takes the lead. So he, as the new leader of the Hebrews, he takes them into the land of Canaan. Tribal settlements based on the 12 tribes, the 12 sons of Jacob, are established. And the nation of Israel begins with God using judges to help them live righteously and to honor the Lord. Now, Israel at this point is a theocracy. God is their king, God is their ruler, and he has appointed judges to help them live properly. During this time period of the judges, the book of Ruth takes place in history. And the book of Ruth recounts the story of a family who are redeemed by a kinsman of Israel. And this is, of course, foreshadowing our Redeemer in Jesus Christ. The period of the judges begins about 400 BC, not 400, 1400 BC, sorry, and ends in 1052 BC, and that is when Saul is anointed king. Let's take a quick look at the tribal settlements at this time. You will notice that Joseph is a son of Jacob, but he's not up here. His two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, take his place. You will also notice that Levi, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, is also not up here because God created the Levitical priesthood, and their portion was the Lord. So he did not give them land like the rest of the tribes. He gave them partial settlements throughout the 12 tribes. But he always said that their portion was the Lord himself because they were the priesthood that God established. 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So this tells us about the monarchy of Israel is now established, and we see its rise and we see its fall. Samuel, the last judge, anoints Saul, who reigns from 1052 BC, followed by King David, who begins reigning in 1010 BC and dies in 970 BC. David's son Solomon reigns from 971 BC to 931 BC, after which the kingdom of Israel splits in two. So this is a significant turning point in the history of Israel. So Saul, David, and Solomon had one united kingdom. Solomon dies. Disobedience causes the kingdom to split, essentially, and there are many more details in this story. God raises up prophets all throughout this period to speak on behalf of him to the Hebrews as well as the surrounding nations. The messages are contained, of course, in the major and minor prophets in the books of the Bible, which we're going to look at how they overlap in history. Now, during this time of the monarchy, some of the wisdom books and the poetic books are written. So let's take a look at those. Again, we're not going in order of the Bible, we're going in order chronologically. So Psalms is poetic literature written by several authors, David, Solomon, and Moses being the three main ones. The writings likely span about 900 years of Jewish history. Proverbs, considered wisdom literature, written by many authors, including Solomon, and he is also credited with compiling all of these Proverbs. Ecclesiastes is considered wisdom literature, written by Solomon, and of course the Song of Solomon is poetic literature written by Solomon. And Ecclesiastes describes the author's attempt to find meaning and contentment in worldly living and temporary things. And the Song of Solomon magnifies the virtues of love between a husband and a wife. So let's zoom out and let's take a look at the world. So in this huge map, you'll see the main people groups and nations And Israel under Solomon is that little piece right there. Very similar to what little piece they have now. So that, I just wanted to show you before the split, this is what it looked like. Also want to show you the surrounding kingdoms. When you read the major and minor prophets, they will mention many of these areas. Sorry about that. It's not exactly clear. Apologize. You'll hear about Edom. You'll hear about Moab, Ammon, of course, Canaan, Aram, the Aramean area. So God sends messages to many of these nations. This is just to show you where they are. So during this time period of the monarchy, these are the prophets that speak. Joel, Jonah, Amos, Isaiah, and Hosea. Now, there are two other prophets that don't have their own books, Elijah and Elisha, and their stories are contained in 1st and 2nd Kings, so they are considered prophets as well. The common theme of the prophets is to repent of your sin and to live righteously. So what's going on in the world around the divided kingdom right now? God is raising up Assyria in the meantime, when Israel's trying to get their monarchy figured out. Assyria becomes the dominant power in this region. You can see the Assyrian Empire at the time. The capital of the Assyrian Empire is Nineveh, and you can see how small the northern kingdom of Israel is and the southern kingdom of Judah is in comparison to this nation that God has risen up. The capital of the northern kingdom was Samaria, and the capital of Judah, of course, was Jerusalem at the time. So the northern kingdom at this point is on just full-on rebellion against God. The monarchy is corrupt. The people are not obeying. They have started performing pagan practices that the Canaanites did because they didn't completely wipe them out like God told them to do when they settled in the land of Canaan. So all this is coming back to haunt them just like God told them would happen. So God uses Assyria to conquer the northern kingdom in judgment upon them, and he scatters them around the Assyrian Empire. So it's in 722 BC that the northern kingdom falls. The prophets during this time period, Micah, Nahum, Zephaniah, Jeremiah, who also writes Lamentations, and Habakkuk. Now, keep in mind, I have written here who the prophets speak to or about. That's the major message. That's the recipient of the major message. Also know that there are portions where these prophets have messages for those surrounding kingdoms that I just showed you, such as Edom and Moab and Ammon. The Assyrian Empire starts to decline. God's raising another empire, and the southern kingdom of Judah is still in existence at this point. In 612 BC, Nabopolassar, king of Babylon, conquers Nineveh, which was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. This begins the fall in earnest of this nation. Around 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, who is now king of Babylon, finally conquers the rest of the Assyrian Empire, and thus starts the Babylonian Empire. You'll also notice that in the pink, there's a Mede Empire. They aren't, for whatever reason, seemingly as strong at this point as the Babylonian Empire. Judah at this time becomes more and more rebellious and disobedient. And so God begins to judge Judah. So what happens is, in 586, well, first around 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar starts pulling out the wise young Hebrews that he can use in his kingdom. So he starts to deport them and brings them to Babylon. And there's 3 deportations. The final deportation is the destruction of Judah. And that ends the nation of Israel as they knew it at that time. It's no more. That final deportation is in 586 BC. So at this point, the monarchy has fallen. Babylonian Empire is the force to be reckoned with. Now the Hebrews are scattered sort of all over this map, not only in Babylon, but also in the Median land, controlled land as well. So this sets the stage for the next books, which are Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. But let's take a quick look at the prophets during this time, during this last exile. Daniel, Ezekiel, and Obadiah. Now, during this exile, God is raising the next empire. And y'all notice the Median Empire. But underneath that was a small Persian empire, very powerful. In 550 BC, Cyrus the Great, who was king of Persia, conquers Media. So you guys saw all that pink land in the prior slide. In 539 BC, he conquers the Babylonian Empire. Okay, so now we have the great Persian Empire. Cyrus the Great is king. And in 538 BC, God uses him to issue a decree allowing the Hebrews to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. So God's giving them a glimmer of hope. The book of Ezra recounts the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, which takes from 538 to 516 BC. Zechariah is a prophet at this time, and he ministers to the Hebrews who have actually gone back to Jerusalem from the Persian Empire. Haggai, 520 BC, he also ministers and prophesies to those Hebrews who also have come back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. Esther takes place during the Persian reign of Xerxes from 483 to 473 BC. So this historical narrative describes the events of a potential Holocaust of the Hebrew people living in the Persian Empire at that time, were it not for this young Hebrew girl Esther, who would become the Persian queen. Nehemiah, historically, chronologically, then comes next, and he was the cupbearer of the Persian king Artaxerxes around 446 BC, and he was allowed to return to Jerusalem to lead the Jerusalem wall rebuilding project. So at that time, when you had major cities, you needed a wall because you were surrounded by enemies. And in this case, they're rebuilding the temple, they're reestablishing their nation, they've got to build a wall because Jerusalem is an exceedingly important city. Malachi was the last prophet to speak. This closes the Old Testament canon, and then we move into the intertestamental period between the writings of the Old Testament and the New Testament. So let's see what's happening in the world that sets the stage for the incarnation of Jesus. During the intertestamental period, between 334 and 331 BC, Alexander the Great, he defeats Persia, starting the rise of the Greek Empire. He purposefully spreads Greek culture and language to all of these areas that he's conquered. Don't discount this, because what he does is he creates one language in this huge swath of land. And this becomes very important when we move into the Gospel period, after Jesus' birth. After the death of Alexander in 323 BC, the Greek Empire was divided into 4 regions. Now, they were tolerant of Jewish practices at this time, so the Hebrew people are still there. God's just setting the stage for the new covenant. Over a period of about 100 years, from 230 BC, around that time, to 133 BC, the Romans are chipping away at the Greek Empire until they finally conquer it. This map shows us the Roman Empire around the early 2nd century AD. So what I wanted you guys to notice was just the vast land area that the Romans controlled. When the Romans would go into and conquer nations, they would build roads. They wanted to be able to get around easily to check on all of their regions, all of their people groups. Keep this in mind, because This is what God's putting together for the incarnation of Jesus. During this span of time, during the Greek and Roman rule, two religious and political groups emerged in Israel. One are the Pharisees and two are the Sadducees. So the Pharisees added to the law of Moses through oral tradition and eventually considered their own laws more important than God's laws. Okay. Now the Sadducees held only to the Mosaic books, so the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They did not believe in any kind of resurrection. They admired the Greek culture to a great extent, and they were considered the aristocratic elite in the Hebrew culture. These are the Roman emperors. So up to this time period, Rome was a republic. Julius Caesar crosses the Rubicon, which basically declares war against the republic. And then we start the emperors, which, as you guys probably know, devolves into tyrannical rule of the Roman Empire. So I wanted you to just have this, just so you would know sort of the backdrop of the part of the this part of the New Testament. So it was during the reign of Augustus that Jesus was born. The Gospels. So why were there 4 Gospels written? Because each of them have their own specific purpose, audience, and emphasis. So God is wanting to give you a broad level of details from 4 different personalities. So this, I got this from Steve because I wanted this to be familiar to you guys. So this is exactly what he puts up there. Matthew emphasizes Jesus as king, Jesus as son of David. His audience is primarily Jews, and his emphasis is on Jesus' sermons. Mark emphasizes Jesus as a servant. There is no genealogy given. His audience are the Romans, so basically the culture at large. And his emphasis is on the miracles. Luke emphasizes Jesus as the Son of Man. Genealogy starts with Adam. His audience are the Greeks, which would include us because essentially those were the Gentiles, people who are not derived from Jewish, and there may be some Jewish people in here. Sorry about that, we're not all Gentiles. But that was Luke's audience, and his emphasis is on the parables, which was the way Jesus taught certain things. John's emphasis is Jesus as the Son of God. His genealogy is it's eternal. His audience is universal, so everyone, Jewish, Gentile. And his emphasis is on Jesus' signs, the miracles that he performs. The next book, Acts. So this recounts the history of the early church. It was written by Luke, the same author as the Gospel Luke. It's the history of the early church. It recounts the story of Saul and his spectacular conversion events. And then just make a note that after that conversion, when Saul is appointed the Gentiles to go out and minister to, he starts using his Roman name, Paul. Thus becomes the Apostle Paul and pens many books, 13, maybe 14 books in the New Testament. So where does this early church begin? Where is it established? Okay, for some reason when I made the handouts, the arrows did not appear. So I may want to circle. Another thing to notice is that the city of Colossae was also not on this map. And oh yeah, by the way, Steve happened to use the same map last Sunday in his sermon. God, that looks familiar. So we're both going to the same websites. Okay, so if you'll notice, I'm just going to call these out and you'll recognize all of these. Rome, Corinth, Thessalonica, Philippi, Ephesus, Colossae, and of course Galatia. And so thus begins the establishment of the churches across the Roman Empire.
Just a minute.
Okay.
Let us finish reading circle.
Yes. Okay. I can take a drink.
Okay.
All right. We're good? If y'all ever need any of this information, just, please reach out to me. I'm always sitting in the front row on the left side of the first service. Easy to find. Okay, so the letters written to the churches that Paul penned are Galatians, and these are in chronological order, based on scholarship and dating. So Galatians probably written the earliest. Then Paul writes 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans. Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians were written while Paul was in prison. So those are usually referred to as the prison epistles. Paul also wrote 4 letters, to specific people. Philemon, he wrote this letter also while imprisoned in Rome, and it addresses the situation between Philemon, who is the owner of a slave called Onesimus. Then he writes 1st and 2nd Timothy, which are considered pastoral epistles, which we are learning 2nd Timothy right now. Then he also wrote Titus, which is also a pastoral epistle. Titus was the leader of the church in Crete that Paul established on one of his missionary journeys. Now the remainder of the New Testament epistles, Hebrews, unknown author, some scholars believe Paul, some don't. James, which was written by James, the half-brother of Jesus. 1st and 2nd Peter, which was written by the Apostle Peter. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, which was written by the Apostle John. Jude, written by the half-brother of Jesus. And then, of course, Revelation, written by John while he was exiled on the island of Patmos. Because tradition holds that they tried to murder him and he just would not die. But of course, the rest of the apostles were martyred. And so it's something that I want you guys to keep in mind. Why would you die a torturous death at the hands of any tyrannical empire if you did not believe that it was true? So that's just something to keep in mind before we go into our next session.